help me. Please, I can't breathe." Richard Blackstone whispered desperately, trying to communicate while choking in the middle of the gala. In that moment of total panic, everyone was speechless, and they couldn't imagine who could be the billionaire's salvation. Kevin Marshall lived in an expensive apartment in Midtown Manhattan, where he woke up every morning looking at his reflection in the mirror and slicking his hair with gel. At 42, he had been the manager of the Grand Palace Hotel for 5 years. "Perfect," he muttered to himself, adjusting his red tie. "Today will be another day to show who's boss." Kevin loved power. He walked the hotel corridors with heavy steps, always wearing a dark suit and shoes that squeaked on the marble. His small, cold eyes searched for employees to criticize. "You! Come here now!" he shouted to a young man carrying towels. The boy ran to him, trembling. "Yes, Mr. Marshall. These towels are folded wrong. Redo them." Kevin pointed his finger in the boy's face. "And next time, think before you do something wrong." The young man lowered his head. "I'm sorry, sir." "Sorry doesn't pay," Kevin smiled cruelly. "Now get out of my sight." This was Kevin's daily routine. He drank expensive coffee, yelled at employees, and felt important by humiliating those who couldn't defend themselves. On his desk was a gold plaque that read, "Manager Kevin Marshall, respect is mandatory. Employees are like dogs," he would tell other managers over lunch. "If you don't show them who's boss, they'll get on your head." Across town, in a small one-bedroom apartment, Grace Thompson woke up at 5 in the morning. At 32, she had brown hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that smiled even when she was tired. "Good morning, Mom," he whispered into the phone every morning, calling his mother back in Ohio. "How did you sleep?" "I'm fine. My daughter. And you? Is this new job going well?" Grace looked out the small apartment window. "It's been, an experience." She didn't talk about the humiliations. She didn't want to worry her mother. Grace arrived at the Grand Palace Hotel at 6:30, always through the staff entrance at the back. She put on her simple uniform, a white blouse and black skirt, and tied on an apron. "Good morning," he said softly to other employees. Most of them didn't even respond. "Hey, Grace," called Sandra, an older maid. "Did you bring snacks from home again?" Grace held up a simple bread and butter sandwich. "Yes, saving a little." "Man, you're so uptight," laughed Mark, a new waiter. "I bet you don't even know how to stand up for yourself." "She's too quiet," agreed Lisa, another maid. "Here at the Grand Palace, if you don't shout, you're not heard." Grace just smiled shyly. "I prefer to work in silence." "Silence doesn't get you a raise," Mark scoffed. "You need to assert yourself more, Grace. Otherwise, they'll walk all over you forever." As she cleaned luxurious rooms, Grace admired the city view from the window. The rooms cost more per night than she earned in a month, but she wasn't envious. She was grateful for the work. "Excuse me," she would say whenever she had to pass guests in the hallway. She would duck her head and smile, even when they didn't even notice her. At night, Grace would come home and call her mother again. "Daughter, you look tired." "I'm learning a lot, Mom. The important thing is that I'm working honestly." "You've always been like this, Grace. Ever since you were little, always kind to everyone." Grace smiled to herself in the dark apartment. She went to bed early to wake up early, always dreaming that one day things would get better. She believed that by being good and working hard, she would eventually be recognized. At the Grand Palace Hotel, the marble corridors gleamed under golden lights. It was a place where important people came to conduct business and hold elegant parties. Grace cleaned these corridors every day, unseen by most. "Grace, have you lost something?" Kevin Marshall asked one day, finding her looking at a picture on the wall. "No, Mr. Marshall, just admiring the decor." "Employees aren't paid to admire, they're paid to work." His eyes grew harder. "Don't forget your place here." "Yes, sir," Grace replied quietly, returning to her work. But deep down, Grace knew she deserved respect. She just didn't know how to get it. Stage 1, impact hook. Hook, introduction. 300 characters. Help me, please, I can't breathe, Richard Blackstone whispered desperately, trying to communicate while choking in the middle of the gala. In that moment of total panic, no one imagined that the most humiliated employee at the Grand Palace Hotel would be his only salvation. Count 296 characters. Stage 2, presenting the world and characters the villain, Kevin Marshall. Kevin Marshall lived in an expensive apartment in Midtown Manhattan, where he woke up every morning looking at his reflection in the mirror and slicking his hair with gel. At 42, he had been the manager of the Grand Palace Hotel for 5 years. Perfect, he muttered to himself, adjusting his red tie. Today will be another day to show who's boss. Kevin loved power. He walked the hotel corridors with heavy steps, always wearing a dark suit and shoes that squeaked on the marble. His small, cold eyes searched for employees to criticize. "You, come here now," he shouted to a young man carrying towels. The boy ran to him, trembling. Yes, Mr. Marshall. These towels are folded wrong. Redo them." Kevin pointed his finger in the boy's face. Next time, think before you do something wrong." The young man lowered his head. "I'm sorry, sir." "Sorry doesn't pay." Kevin smiled cruelly. "Now get out of my sight." This was Kevin's daily routine. He drank expensive coffee, yelled at employees, and felt important by humiliating those who couldn't defend themselves. On his desk was a gold plaque that read, "Manager Kevin Marshall. Respect is mandatory. Employees are like dogs," he would tell other managers over lunch. "If you don't show them who's boss, they'll get on your head." The heroine, Grace Thompson. Across town, in a small one-bedroom apartment, Grace Thompson woke up at 5 in the morning. At 32, she had brown hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that smiled even when she was tired. "Good morning, Mom," he whispered into the phone every morning, calling his mother back in Ohio. "How did you sleep?" "I'm fine, my daughter. And you? Is this new job going well?" Grace looked out the small apartment window. "It's been an experience." She didn't talk about the humiliations. She didn't want to worry her mother. Grace arrived at the Grand Palace Hotel at 6:30, always through the staff entrance at the back. She put on her simple uniform, a white blouse and black skirt, and tied on an apron. "Good morning," he said softly to other employees. Most of them didn't even respond. "Hey, Grace," called Sandra, an older maid. "Did you bring snacks from home again?" Grace held up a simple bread and butter sandwich. "Yes, saving a little." "Man, you're so uptight," laughed Mark, a new waiter. "I bet you don't even know how to stand up for yourself." "She's too quiet," agreed Lisa, another maid. "Here at the Grand Palace, if you don't shout, you're not heard." Grace just smiled shyly. "I prefer to work in silence." "Silence doesn't get you a raise," Mark scoffed. "You need to assert yourself more, Grace. Otherwise, they'll walk all over you forever." As she cleaned luxurious rooms, Grace admired the city view from the window. The rooms cost more per night than she earned in a month, but she wasn't envious. She was grateful for the work. "Excuse me," she would say whenever she had to pass guests in the hallway. She would duck her head and smile, even when they didn't even notice her. At night, Grace would come home and call her mother again. "Daughter, you look tired." "I'm learning a lot, Mom. The important thing is that I'm working honestly." "You've always been like this, Grace. Ever since you were little, always kind to everyone." Grace smiled to herself in the dark apartment. She went to bed early to wake up early, always dreaming that one day things would get better. She believed that by being good and working hard, she would eventually be recognized. At the Grand Palace Hotel, the marble corridors gleamed under golden lights. It was a place where important people came to conduct business and hold elegant parties. Grace cleaned these corridors every day, unseen by most. "Grace, have you lost something?" Kevin Marshall asked one day, finding her looking at a picture on the wall. "No, Mr. Marshall, just admiring the decor." "Employees aren't paid to admire. They're paid to work." His eyes grew harder. "Don't forget your place here." Yes, sir, Grace replied quietly, returning to her work. But deep down, Grace knew she deserved respect. She just didn't know how to get it. It was Friday, December 15th, the most anticipated night of the year at the Grand Palace Hotel. The main ballroom had been transformed into a veritable gilded palace. Giant crystal chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, and tables covered with white silk tablecloths held arrangements of red roses that cost more than Grace's monthly salary. The gleaming marble floor reflected the lights like a mirror. "Move, move, move!" Kevin Marshall yelled, his voice echoing through the room like a drum. His hands clapped nervously. "Today is the most important charity gala of the year. We have billionaires, politicians, celebrities. One mistake and you're all out." The staff scurried back and forth like worker ants. Grace polished each crystal goblet until it gleamed like a diamond, her hands trembling slightly from the pressure. "Grace, these flowers are crooked," Sandra shouted, pointing to an arrangement. "Kevin will have a fit if he sees this." "Sorry, I'll fix it," Grace replied softly, carefully arranging each rose. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the first guests began arriving. Luxury cars pulled up in front of the hotel. Mercedes, BMWs, Bentleys, and elegant guests descended like princes and princesses. Women in dresses costing more than a small house walked red carpets. Men in tuxedos chatted about million-dollar deals. "My God, look at all these important people," whispered Lisa, a new employee hiding behind a column. "We'd better be invisible," Mark replied, holding a tray. "These people won't even look at us." At 8 o'clock, a special buzz took over the hall. "Richard Blackstone has arrived," whispered the head receptionist, her eyes shining with excitement. "I can't believe it." "The hospital billionaire is here," replied another, almost screaming softly. Grace stopped arranging the napkins and looked toward the entrance. Richard Blackstone was 48 years old, with slicked-back grey hair and a simple but elegant tuxedo. What caught her attention most were his eyes, kind, smiling even before his mouth did. "Good evening," he said to the doorman, shaking his hand affectionately. "Thank you for taking such good care of us all." The doorman was surprised. Most of the wealthy guests didn't even see the staff. Grace continued to watch as Richard greeted people. He looked each person in the eye, listened attentively, and always had a kind word. "Thank you," he said to a young waiter who brought him a glass of water. "You and your staff are doing a wonderful job here." "Thank you, sir," stammered the waiter, not used to such kindness. This man is really different," Grace thought, feeling something warm in her heart. Dinner began promptly at 9. The room was packed with 300 important guests. Grace and 20 other staff members served dishes that looked like works of art. Alaskan salmon with a special sauce, fresh asparagus, and a chocolate dessert that looked like a jewel. "Everyone, pay attention!" announced the party host, a dapper man in a tuxedo. "Now our guest of honor, Mr. Richard Blackstone, will speak about the life-changing project." The entire room fell silent. Richard slowly stood up, took the golden microphone, and smiled at everyone. Grace stopped collecting dishes to listen. "Good evening, friends." His voice was warm, full of emotion. "I'm so happy to be here with you for a cause that's so passionate about me, helping families who can't afford medical care." Polite applause filled the hall. "And I grew up poor," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "My mother died because we couldn't afford the medicine she needed, so every hospital I build, every child I help heal, is a way of honoring her memory." Some people discreetly wiped their eyes. "Every dollar you donate today will directly save lives, and there is nothing more important than that in the world." The applause was now louder, more sincere. "So, to kick off the donations, I'm donating $5 million to Thunk." Suddenly, Richard stopped talking. His face changed completely. He grimaced strangely and put his hand to his throat, his eyes wide with fright. I... He tried to continue, but the words wouldn't come out. Some people chuckled, thinking it was part of the performance. Richard began to cough, slowly at first, then harder, much harder. The microphone fell from his hands and made a loud, ugly thud as it hit the marble floor. "Help," he whispered, but his voice was almost gone. Grace dropped the tray she was holding. She saw something no one else did. Richard wasn't joking. His eyes were filled with pure terror. "Oh my God, he's choking!" screamed a woman in a blue dress. It was like someone had shouted, "Fire!" in the cinema. The entire room descended into complete chaos. Elegant people began rushing back and forth, bumping into chairs and knocking crystal glasses onto the floor. "Call the ambulance now!" yelled a man in a tuxedo, his voice thin with desperation. "Where's a doctor? Is there a doctor here?" cried another. "Call 911, quick! Someone do something!" Richard fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes. He was desperate, clutching his throat with both hands, trying to dislodge whatever was blocking his breathing. The seconds felt like hours. The room that had once seemed like a golden dream now felt like a nightmare. Richard remained on the floor, his face growing blue, while 300 important people were completely lost. "Someone do something!" screamed a hysterical woman, her hands shaking. "I don't know what to do," cried a rich man, running in circles. The hotel security guards, big, strong men who looked like superheroes, stood still as statues, unsure how to help. What do we do, boss?" One security guard asked another, sweating coldly. I don't know. This has never happened before. But didn't you learn first aid?" "We only learned how to get quarrelsome people out of the hotel." "Everyone stop where you are!" Kevin Marshall yelled, appearing in the middle of the room like a furious king. His eyes were red with rage. "Staff! Stand back now!" "But Mr. Marshall," Mark began, "the man is—" "I don't want to hear it. You guys get out of the mind." Kevin pointed his finger like a gun. "A worker's place is serving, not getting into situations they don't understand." Grace stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding like a drum. "Mr. Marshall, I know how—" "You—" Kevin turned to Grace with a disgusted look on his face. "You think you know more than doctors and important people." The important people Kevin admired so much continued to run around, lost. Some cried, others called on their cell phones, screaming, but no one helped Richard. "This isn't our place, Grace," Sandra whispered, pulling Grace by the arm. "We could get fired." "That's true," Lisa agreed, glancing nervously at Kevin. "Employees like us shouldn't get involved." "Let the rich people figure it out," Mark muttered. "Let them sort it out." Grace tried to break free, but other employees held her back. "Please, I know how to help," Grace begged. "Shut up!" Kevin yelled, coming toward her. "Who do you think you are? A 3-month-old maid is going to teach important people." Kevin's face was red as a tomato. He looked like a scary monster. "You're pathetic, Grace." He spat the words like venom. "Always trying to get attention, always thinking you're special." Grace felt tears burning in her eyes. Kevin's words stung like punches to the gut. Meanwhile, Richard's condition worsened. His body began to go limp like a rag doll. His eyes were nearly closing. A wealthy woman knelt beside Richard and began to cry. "Please don't die, you are such a good man." But crying didn't save anyone. Kevin continued to humiliate Grace in front of everyone. "Look at that!" he shouted, pointing at her. "The maid thinks she's a doctor. What a joke!" Some employees laughed nervously, afraid of Kevin. "Grace was always a bit strange," whispered a waiter. "She thinks she's better than us," agreed another. Grace had never felt so small in her life. She wanted to disappear, vanish, turn to dust. But every time she looked at Richard, she saw a good man dying. "And you'll see," Kevin continued shouting, "when the ambulance arrives, the real doctors will sort everything out, and that insignificant employee will see how ridiculous she is." Kevin's voice echoed through the room like thunder. Everyone looked at Grace with pity or mockery. She was the center of attention, but in the most humiliating way possible. Richard made a faint noise. Grrr! Grrr! Like an engine breaking down. His lips were blue as ink. His hands stopped shaking. He was almost unconscious. "Oh my God, he's going to die!" screamed a woman, fainting. The situation was becoming impossible. A good man was dying. Important people were helpless. Something changed in Grace's face. She stopped shaking. Her tears dried. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with a different light, pure determination. Grace looked at Richard on the floor, then at Kevin screaming, then at all those rich and important people running around lost like scared children. And she made the bravest decision of her life. "He arrives." Grace's voice cut through the air like a bolt of lightning. Everyone stopped. The entire room fell silent for 2 seconds. Kevin's mouth fell open. "What did you say?" "I said enough," Grace repeated, even louder. Her voice was different, strong, firm, resolute. "A man is dying, and you're wasting time with nonsense." Grace broke free from the other employees, arms with a strength no one knew she had. "Grace, don't do this," Sandra pleaded. "You're going to be fired," Mark shouted, but Grace didn't care anymore. She began walking toward Richard with firm, determined steps. "Get back here now," Kevin yelled, his face turning purple. "I'm telling you to stop." Grace didn't even look back. "Move out of the way," she said to the wealthy people who were crowded around Richard. "Who are you to order us?" asked a man in an expensive tuxedo. "I'm someone who knows how to save him," Grace replied, her eyes fixed on Richard. People began to whisper, "Who does she think she is? An employee ordering us around? How absurd!" But Grace wasn't listening to anyone anymore. She knelt beside Richard. He was barely conscious, his face as blue as the night sky. "Mr. Blackstone," she whispered close to his ear, "I will help you. Trust me." Richard opened his eyes slightly and looked at Grace. Even nearly dead, he managed a small nod, as if saying, "Yes." Kevin ran up to Grace, furious as a bull. "You're fired. Get out of him now." "We'll figure this out later," Grace said without looking at Kevin, placing her hands on Richard's back. "Right now, I need to save a life." Grace sat Richard down, slipped her arms under his armpits, and positioned his hands in the right place, one fist just above his navel, the other hand on top. 300 people stopped talking. The room became as quiet as a church. Grace took a deep breath. "Come on," she muttered, pushed hard in and up. Once, nothing, twice. Nothing. "It's not working," someone cried. "I knew it was bullshit," Kevin shouted. But Grace didn't give up. She remembered her grandmother, remembered how she had to be strong when no one else knew what to do. Third time. He pushed with all the strength he had, and then plop! A piece of meat flew from Richard's mouth like a bullet, soared through the air, and landed on the marble floor with a wet thud. Richard made the most beautiful noise Grace had ever heard in her life. "Ah!" He was breathing. "Oh my God!" someone screamed. "She did it. He's alive," Richard breathed, as if for the first time in his life. His cheeks turned pink again. His eyes flew open. He was saved. Grace continued to hold Richard, helping him breathe properly. "Easy," she whispered. "Breathe slowly. You're okay now." The whole hall exploded. Incredible. How did she know to do that? She saved his life. People who seconds before were mocking Grace now looked at her as if she were an angel who had fallen from heaven. Kevin Marshall stood there like a statue, his mouth open, unable to say anything. Richard, still weak but conscious, held Grace's hand. "You," he whispered hoarsely, "you saved my life." Grace smiled, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You are a good man, Mr. Blackstone. You deserve to live." At that moment, something magical happened at the Grand Palace Hotel. The most humiliated maid had become the heroine of the night. Richard sat in a golden chair, still a little weak but breathing normally. Grace had placed a glass of water in his hands and was standing beside him, watching him like a caring nurse. The paramedics arrived 5 minutes later, 5 minutes too late to save Richard, but just in time to confirm that Grace had done everything perfectly. "Señorita, you did an exceptional job," said the lead paramedic. An experienced man with greying hair, the maneuver was executed flawlessly. "Where did you learn first aid?" Grace blushed with embarrassment, looking down at her shoes. It was no big deal," she muttered softly, "but the people around wouldn't let it pass." An elegant lady in a black dress approached, her eyes still shining with excitement. "Blackstone's life," she said, grabbing Grace's arm. "How did you know exactly what to do? Are you a nurse? A doctor?" Grace shook her head, still embarrassed. "No, ma'am, I'm just a maid." "Nothing, maid," interrupted a white-haired man. "You're a hero. But tell me, where did you learn this technique?" All the important people in the room gathered around Grace, curious and admiring. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention in a good way. Grace took a deep breath and looked at Richard, who smiled encouragingly. I learned from taking care of my grandmother," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother?" asked the lady in black, interested. Grace nodded, tears beginning to shine in her eyes. "Grandma Emma lived with me. She was 78 years old and very sick. She took a lot of medicine and sometimes choked on the pills." People gathered closer, listening to every word as if it were the most important story in the world. "One day, she choked badly on a large pill," Grace continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I was alone with her. There was no one to help. So I ran to the library computer and researched what to do." "So," Richard asked, his voice still husky but full of affection, "I watched YouTube videos, read articles about first aid. I taught myself the Heimlich maneuver because I was afraid it would happen to Grandma again." A younger woman discreetly wiped her eyes. "What beautiful love for your grandmother," she whispered. Grace smiled sadly. "She was all I had in the world. My parents died when I was little. Grandma raised me." "And what happened to her?" asked a gentleman in a tuxedo kindly. Grace paused, swallowed hard, and continued. "Grandma Emma became increasingly ill. She needed 24-hour care. I worked in a clothing store, but I quit to take care of her." "Wow," someone sighed. "I took care of Grandma for 2 years, Grace said, her voice growing stronger with pride. "I gave her medicine, bathed her, talked to her, read books aloud to her. I never let her feel alone." Richard held Grace's hand, moved. "You are a very special person, Grace." Grace shook her head. "I just did what any granddaughter would do, but when she died, I was left alone. No job, no money, no family." Silence fell over the group. All those wealthy and important people were listening to Grace's story as if it were a sad movie. "How did you end up here in New York?" asked the lady in black. I lived in a small town in Ohio," Grace explained, wiping away a tear. "After Grandma died, I couldn't pay the rent on my own. So I sold everything I owned and came to New York to try a new life." "And your mother?" asked Richard. Grace's face brightened a little. "Mom still lives in Ohio. She works in a factory, but the pay is very low. I send her money every week." "Do you send money to your mother?" asked a young woman, impressed. "Yes, I don't earn much here at the hotel, but I always save a little to send to her. Mom doesn't know that sometimes I only eat bread so I can send more money." Several people were visibly moved. "My God," someone whispered. "And why did you choose to work at the hotel?" asked Richard. Grace shrugged. "I tried other jobs, but without experience in New York, it's difficult. The hotel gave me a chance, even without hotel experience." "How are you treated here?" a man asked, looking suspiciously in Kevin Marshall's direction. Grace hesitated, not wanting to cause trouble. "Oh, yeah, it's normal. Every beginning is difficult." But Richard noticed something in Grace's tone. "Grace, you can tell the truth. How are you treated here?" Grace glanced at Kevin, who was standing far away but watching with an angry expression. Then she looked at the other employees, who were whispering among themselves. "Well, sometimes it's kind of hard," she admitted quietly. "I'm still learning, so people get impatient with me. But I understand." "What kind of difficulty?" Richard insisted. Grace took a deep breath. "Sometimes they call me slow, or they say I'm too quiet. They say I should assert myself more, be more aggressive, but I'm not like that. Grandma taught me to be kind to everyone." People looked at each other, clearly touched by Grace's humility and kindness. "How many hours a day do you work?" asked the lady in black. 10 o'clock, Monday through Saturday. On Sundays, I rest and call Mom." "And what do you do in your free time?" Grace smiled shyly. "I like reading at the public library. It's free, and it's warm there in the winter. Sometimes I write letters to Mom, telling her about New York." Richard squeezed Grace's hand tighter. "Grace, you are an example of strength, kindness, and love. Your grandmother and mother must be very proud of you." Grace began to cry softly, but they were tears of good emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone. You are very kind." "Mr. Blackstone, we need to get you to the hospital now," the chief paramedic said, preparing the wheeled stretcher. "You need to be examined thoroughly. Choking can cause internal damage we can't see." Richard shook his head, still holding Grace's hand. "I'm fine. Grace saved me perfectly." "Sir, it's protocol. For the sake of your health." Grace gently released Richard's hand. "He's right, Mr. Blackstone. You need to be examined. I'll be worried if you don't." Richard looked at Grace with a tired but affectionate smile. "Are you sending me to the hospital?" "Yes, sir," Grace said with sweet firmness. "I'll take care of you now." Richard laughed softly, even though it was still weak. "Okay, I will, but only because you ask." The paramedics helped Richard onto the stretcher. Grace walked beside him to the hotel entrance, where the ambulance was waiting with its lights flashing. "Grace!" Richard called, his voice lowered with exhaustion. She moved closer, tilting her ear to listen better. "Thank you," he whispered, squeezing her hand one last time. "Thank you for saving my life." Tears glistened in Grace's eyes. "No need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same thing." Richard shook his head slowly. "No, Grace. 300 people saw me dying, and only you had the courage to help me. You are special." The paramedics began pushing the stretcher into the ambulance. "Grace!" Richard called again, more urgently now. "Yes, I want to talk to—" "See you later," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "When I get out of the hospital. Promise you'll wait for me." Grace felt butterflies in her stomach. She wasn't sure what Richard wanted to say, but something about the way he looked at her made her heart beat faster. I promise, Mr. Blackstone." "Richard, call me Richard." "I promise, Richard." He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Thank you for everything." The ambulance doors closed with a metallic clang. The sirens began to blare, and the red and blue lights flashed one last time before the ambulance disappeared into the New York night. Grace stood on the sidewalk, watching until she could no longer see the ambulance's lights. Her heart was pounding, filled with emotions she couldn't quite explain. "He wants to talk to me later," she muttered to herself, smiling without realizing it. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt something she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his life could change for the better. Grace entered the hotel, her heart still pounding with excitement. The ballroom was still full of guests, but now everyone was whispering about what had just happened. Incredible what the employee did. I've never seen anything like it. She really saved his life. Grace smiled shyly as a few people looked at her in admiration. For the first time in her life, she felt appreciated. But the happiness only lasted a few seconds. Grace Thompson. Kevin Marshall's voice cut through the air like a knife. He stood in the middle of the room, his face red with anger. his fists clenched as if he were about to fight someone. Grace stopped in her tracks, her smile fading immediately. "Yes, Mr. Marshall, come here now." All the guests stopped talking. The room was as quiet as a graveyard. Grace walked slowly toward Kevin, her heart now pounding with fear, not joy. Kevin waited until she got really close, then shouted so everyone could hear, "You're fired!" The words fell on Grace like a bucket of cold water. "Did you? What?" she stammered, not believing what she was hearing. "You heard that right. Fired! Get your things and get out of my hotel!" The guests began to whisper among themselves, shocked. Is he firing her? But she just saved a life. How absurd! Grace felt tears burning in her eyes. "Mr. Marshall, I don't understand. I saved Mr. Blackstone. I helped." "Helped?" Kevin laughed, like an evil hyena. "You wanted to show off. You got in where you don't believe. But he was dying." "He wasn't dying," Kevin yelled, spitting the words like venom. "The billionaire wasn't in real-life risk. You made up a drama to get attention." Grace's mouth fell open. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "How can you say that? Everyone saw that he couldn't breathe. Everyone saw you showing off." Kevin pointed his finger in her face. "Staff like you can't touch important guests. You violated all the rules." A lady in a black dress tried to intervene. "Sorry, but this girl saved." "Shut up!" Kevin yelled at the lady. "This is hotel business." The woman was shocked by the rudeness, but Kevin didn't care. Grace looked around, seeking support from the other employees. Sandra, Mark, Lisa. They were all staring at the floor in fear. "Sandra," Grace called softly, "you saw what happened, right?" Sandra didn't look up. I didn't see anything, Grace." "Mark, you were here. Tell him Mr. Blackstone was really choking." Mark shook his head nervously. "Sorry, Grace. I can't interfere." Grace felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Her own classmates had abandoned her. Kevin smiled cruelly. "See, nobody is going to defend you because everyone knows you're a show-off." "I'm not a show-off," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to help." "You wanted to show off to the billionaire," Kevin kept yelling. "Did you think he would fall in love with you, that he would give you money? It's not true." "Of course it is. A poor maid dreaming of marrying a billionaire. How pathetic." Every word Kevin said was like a knife to Grace's heart. She was being destroyed in front of 300 people. "Mr. Marshall, please," she begged. "I need this job. I send money to my mother." "I don't care," Kevin yelled. "You disobeyed my orders. You've stuck in where you don't believe." A man in a tuxedo tried to speak. "Boy, you're being unfair. She really saved." "You're not my boss," Kevin yelled at the man. "I decide who works at my hotel." Kevin turned to the security guards. "Escort this employee out. She doesn't work here anymore." "No, please," Grace cried, falling to her knees in the middle of the Golden Hall. "I need this job. My mother. She depends on me. I should have thought about this before I disobeyed." The security guards approached Grace, awkwardly but obeying orders. "Come on, Grace," one of them said softly. "You'd better go." Grace struggled to her feet, her legs shaking like leaves. She took one last look at the guests, hoping someone would do something. But everyone stood still, watching in silence. Grace walked slowly toward the employee exit, escorted by security. With each step, she felt smaller, more humiliated, more broken. Kevin shouted one last time, "And don't come back here again. You are banned from entering the Grand Palace." Grace walked out the back door, onto the dark, cold New York street. She was alone, jobless, broke, and hopeless. What should have been the happiest night of his life had become his worst nightmare. Grace walked the dark streets of New York like a ghost. Her legs were weak, her heart shattered into a million pieces. The early morning chill bit at her skin, but the pain inside was far worse. She arrived at her small apartment at 2 in the morning. The old building had a staircase that creaked with every step. Grace climbed slowly, holding onto the railing to keep from falling. When she opened the apartment door, Grace collapsed. She sat on the cold living room floor and cried like a lost child. Her tears wet the floor like a storm. Her whole body trembled, from cold, from anger, from pain. "Why?" she asked the dark ceiling. "Why did this happen to me?" But no one answered. She was completely alone. Grace cried until her tears dried. Then she crawled into her small bed and wrapped herself in the thin blanket, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying Kevin's cruel words. "You wanted to show off." A poor maid dreaming. Pathetic. Early in the morning, the phone rang. Grace looked at her watch. 7:00. She knew who it was. "Hello, Mom," Grace said, trying to sound normal. "Good morning, my daughter. How are you? You look different." Grace squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't tell the truth. Her mother had enough problems already. "I'm fine, Mom, just a little tired." "Did you work hard yesterday?" "Yeah, it was a pretty busy night." His mother laughed on the other end of the line. "I bet. It must be glamorous working in that fancy hotel. My daughter among important people." Grace felt like crying again, but held it back. "How are you, Mom? How is the factory?" "Oh, daughter, it's difficult. The boss said he's going to have to fire some people. I'm scared." Grace's heart sank. Now it was more important than ever to find a new job. "Don't worry, Mom. Everything will be okay." "You always cheer me up, Grace. That's why I love you so much." "I love you too, Mommy." After hanging up the phone, Grace stood up and looked in the mirror. Her eyes were puffy from crying. Her hair was a mess. But she took a deep breath and said to herself, "I'm not giving up. I need a job. Mom needs me." Grace took a cold shower. She had no money for heating. She put on her only good clothes and went out to look for work. First, she went to the cafe on the corner. "Excuse me," she asked the owner. "Are you hiring?" The man looked Grace up and down. "Do you have experience with coffee?" "No, but I'm a fast learner. I used to work at the Grand Palace Hotel." "The Grand Palace?" The man laughed. "If you work there, why do you want to work here?" Grace hesitated. I wanted to try something new." "Sorry, but I need someone with experience." Grace left with her head down. In second place, a clothing store. The answer was the same. "Sales experience?" "No, but..." "Sorry, dear." Third, fourth, fifth. Always the same thing. "Ma, we have no vacancies." "You need to have experience. Come back another day." By the end of the day, Grace had visited 15 different places. No one hired her. She returned home with aching feet and a heavy heart. But the next day, she woke up and tried again. And the next day, and in the other, she spent an entire week looking for a job. Grace saved every penny, eating only bread and water to avoid spending money. She was getting thin, but she didn't give up. "I can't give up," she repeated to herself every morning. "Grandma Emma taught me to be strong. Mommy needs me." A week later, Grace was in the public library reading the newspaper classifieds when a woman approached. "Aren't you the girl who saved the billionaire at the Grand Palace?" Grace looked up in surprise. "How do you know?" "My friend was at the party. She told me everything. You're a hero." Grace smiled sadly. "I'm not a heroine. I'm just a normal person looking for a job." Looking for a job. But why? What happened? Grace hesitated, but then told the whole story. The woman was outraged. "What nonsense! You saved a life and got fired." "Yeah, life is unfair sometimes." The woman shook her head. "What a terrible injustice. But you didn't give up, did you? Are you still looking for a job?" Grace nodded. "I can't give up. My mother needs me." The woman smiled in admiration. "You're so strong, my dear. People like you always manage to bounce back." That night, Grace called her mother as usual. "How was your day, daughter?" "It was, productive, Mom. I'm learning a lot about New York." That's great. You've always been smart. I'm so proud of you. Grace smiled for the first time in a week. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me. Even though she was devastated, even though she was jobless, even though she was struggling, Grace maintained her dignity. She didn't take revenge on Kevin. She didn't badmouth the hotel to anyone. She didn't play the victim. She just continued to be who she always was, a good person, trying to do the best she could. And deep down in her heart, even after everything she had been through, Grace still had faith that things would get better. On Wednesday morning, Grace was leaving yet another failed interview when she saw a black limousine pull up in front of her. The window slowly rolled down, revealing a face she hadn't expected to see. Grace! It was Richard Blackstone. He had a cast on his arm and bandages on his face, but his eyes shone with joy when he saw her. Grace froze in surprise. Mr. Blackstone, are you all right? Come in here, please. We need to talk urgently. Grace hesitated, looking around. People on the street stopped to stare at the luxurious limousine. I don't know if... Grace, please, Richard insisted, his voice filled with urgency. It's very important. Grace stepped into the limousine, her hands shaking nervously. The interior was more luxurious than anywhere she had ever been. Soft leather seats, air conditioning, even a small refrigerator. How did you find me? She asked softly. Richard smiled, but his eyes were serious. I have connections, but that doesn't matter right now. Grace, I need to tell you something terrible. Grace's heart raced. What happened? I found out you were fired, Richard said, his words coming out like thunder. I found out yesterday when I got out of the hospital. I'm absolutely outraged. Grace looked at her hands. You don't need to worry about me, Mr. Blackstone. I'll be fine. How am I not supposed to be worried? Richard yelled, then caught himself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yell. But Grace, you saved my life and you got fired for it. This is the biggest injustice I've ever seen. Mr. Kevin said I got mixed up in something I shouldn't have. Kevin Marshall is an idiot, Richard exploded again. I'm sorry, but I have to tell you the truth. This man is a monster. Grace had never seen Richard so angry. Mr. Blackstone, call me Richard, remember? Richard, Grace corrected. I understand you're angry, but... Grace, look at me, Richard interrupted, gently holding her hands. You saved my life. I was dying. The doctors at the hospital confirmed that if you hadn't performed that maneuver, I would have died within 3 minutes. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I just did what anyone would do. No, Richard said forcefully. 300 people saw me dying and stood by. Only you had the courage to act. Only you knew what to do. Grace began to cry softly. But I lost my job. My mom needs me. I don't know what to do anymore. Richard took out a handkerchief and offered it to Grace. Grace, listen to me. You won't have to worry about a job ever again. Grace looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Richard smiled, a big, genuine smile. I want to offer you a job at my foundation. You will work with me, helping needy families access health care. Grace's mouth dropped open. I don't understand. The salary will be 5 times what you earned at the hotel. You'll have full health insurance, paid vacations, and I'll even pay for you to study nursing if you want. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why? Why? Why would you do this for me? Richard held Grace's hands affectionately. Because you showed me something I had forgotten, Grace. You showed me that there are still truly good people in this world. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Richard laughed. Say you accept. Grace felt like it was a dream. I accept. Of course I accept. Richard clapped his hands in joy. Perfect. You start on Monday, but before that, we have another matter to attend to. What subject? Richard's eyes became hard as iron. Kevin Marshall and the Grand Palace Hotel will pay for what they did to you. Grace was worried. Richard, I don't want any trouble. You won't get in trouble, Richard said decisively. They will get in trouble. I've already called my lawyers. The Grand Palace is being sued for unfair labor practices. But, Grace, listen, Richard said gently. I found out you weren't the first employee Kevin Marshall humiliated. He's done it to others too. He needs to be stopped. Grace took a deep breath. What will happen to him? He'll be fired. The hotel will be fined. And you, Richard smiled, will receive compensation for moral damages. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt something she had forgotten what it felt like. Real, true, solid hope. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Yes, you do, Richard said, smiling. Because good people like you deserve good things in life. The limousine stopped in front of Grace's building. Richard, she said before leaving, thank you for everything. Thank you, Grace, for saving me and for reminding me that it pays to be a good person. Grace stepped out of the limo, feeling like she was flying. For the first time since her dismissal, she was certain everything was going to be okay. Grace stood in her new office at the Blackstone Foundation, looking out the window at Central Park. It was a beautiful spring morning, and she could hardly believe how much her life had changed. Grace! Richard rushed into the office, holding a newspaper and grinning from ear to ear. Have you seen the news? What news? Grace asked, rising from the table full of community projects. The Grand Palace Hotel was officially closed yesterday. Richard pointed to the newspaper headline, and Kevin Marshall was arrested for labor fraud. Grace read the headline with wide eyes. Grand Palace Hotel closed for abusive practices. Manager arrested. Trapped, she repeated in disbelief. The investigation found he'd been stealing money from employees for years, Richard explained, his eyes shining with satisfaction. Unpaid wages, stolen overtime, documented humiliations. He's going to jail for 5 years. Grace sat in her chair, still processing the news. I can't believe it. It's like a movie. And there's more. Richard pulled up a chair. Do you remember the other employees he humiliated? Sandra, Mark, Lisa. Yes, of course. They all testified against Kevin. They said you were always the kindest person they ever knew, and that Kevin was a monster to everyone. Grace felt tears in her eyes. They did this. They did. Mark even said to the lawyers, Grace was the only good person in that damn place. If we had defended her at the time, maybe we wouldn't have spent so much time suffering too. Grace dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Poor things. They were just scared. You always see the best in people, Richard smiled. That's why you're perfect to coordinate our community programs. Richard was right. Within 3 months, Grace had become the Blackstone Foundation's most beloved coordinator. She created first aid programs in poor neighborhoods, organized health campaigns, and helped hundreds of families. Speaking of programs, Grace said excitedly, next week's first aid training already has 200 people signed up. Amazing! Richard clapped his hands. The Grace Thompson first aid program is a hit all over New York. Grace blushed. Richard, you didn't have to put my name on the show. Of course it did, Richard laughed. It was your idea. You created the whole methodology. You trained the instructors. It's only right that it bears your name. Indeed, Grace had created a revolutionary program. She taught first aid in a simple and caring way, telling stories about her grandmother and explaining how small gestures can save lives. Oh, and before I forget, Richard said, picking up an envelope from the table, a very special letter arrived for you. Grace took the envelope. It was from her mother. My darling daughter, Grace read aloud, I can't stop crying tears of joy. The house you bought for me is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. I have my own garden, my own kitchen, and I get to see you every week. You've made my dream come true. I love you forever, Mommy. Now Grace was really crying. Is she happy? Richard asked gently. So much, Grace sobbed. She spent her whole life living in small rented apartments. She's never owned a home. And now Now she has a beautiful house in Long Island, right next to you, Richard added, and you don't have to work at the factory anymore. Grace had bought her mother a two-bedroom house, complete with a garden. It was modest, but it was theirs, and with her foundation's salary, Grace could comfortably support them both. "You know what's amazing?" Grace said, wiping away her tears. "What?" "Mommy wants to learn first aid too. She signed up for the next course." Richard laughed heartily. "I can imagine you teaching first aid to your own mother. It's going to be exciting." Grace smiled. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," Richard shouted. It was Sarah, the new administrative assistant, one of the former Grand Palace employees Grace had helped get a job at the foundation. "Grace, sorry to interrupt, but there's a family down here who wants to thank you." "Thank me?" "It's Mr. Rodriguez's family. Remember, the man who choked at the community party last week?" Grace remembered immediately. During a foundation event, an elderly man had choked on a piece of sandwich. Grace had performed the Heimlich maneuver and saved him for the second time in her life. "They can come up," Grace said. A few minutes later, an entire family walked into the office, an elderly couple, 3 adult children, and 2 young children. "Señorita Grace," Mr. Rodriguez said, tears in his eyes, "you saved my life." "Grandpa told us everything," said one of the children. "You're a superhero." Grace knelt down to the child's level. "I'm not a superhero, honey. I'm just a person who learned to help." "No, no, no!" Mr. Rodriguez's wife shook her head. "You're an angel. If it weren't for you, my husband would have died, and my grandchildren would be left without a grandfather." The whole family embraced Grace at the same time. It was a group hug full of love and gratitude. When they left, Richard looked at Grace in admiration. "You realize what you did, right, Grace?" "What did I do?" "You've created a chain of kindness. Mr. Rodriguez told me he wants to learn first aid too, so he can help others like you helped him." Grace smiled. "It's nice to think about that, isn't it? One person helps another. Who helps another? Who helps another?" "Exactly," Richard agreed. "And it all started with you having the courage to help me that night." Grace looked out the window again, seeing people walking in the park below. "You know, Richard, I've always believed that when we do good, good comes back to us. But I never imagined it would come back in such a perfect way." Richard approached the window too. "You've changed my life too, Grace. Before I met you, all I thought about was making money. Now I wake up every day thinking about how I can help more people. We help each other," Grace said gently. "It's true," Richard smiled. "You saved me in 2 ways. You saved my physical life, and you saved my soul." They remained silent for a few minutes, watching the movement of the city below. Grace thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation in the hotel, the difficult days of job hunting, the despair. And now she was here, helping hundreds of people, with her mother happy, with a purpose in life. "Life is funny, isn't it, Richard?" she said softly, "like this. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are the beginning of the best things." Richard nodded. "You're right. If Kevin hadn't fired you, you never would have come to work here, and hundreds of families wouldn't have been helped." Grace smiled, a smile full of peace. "So, in a weird way, I even thank Kevin." "Grace Thompson," Richard laughed, "you are truly special. Only you would thank the person who has hurt you most in your life." Grace shrugged. "Everyone deserves forgiveness. And besides, if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have discovered how strong I am." That afternoon, Grace returned to her new home, a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, and called her mother as usual. "How was your day, daughter?" "It was perfect, Mom, as always." And it was true. For the first time in her life, Grace could honestly say that every day was perfect. Not because they were easy, but because they were full of purpose, love, and gratitude. End of story.